Okay, this is a Blender 2.8 lesson, if you will. This is really part 3 of what was previously a 2-part video for Blender newbies that I created for my son. Now, what we're looking at today is kind of the least you need to know if you're doing the bulk of your animation work in Krita, which is what he's doing, and you want to be able to bring things into Blender for the express purpose of doing things like 3D camera moves and translation, meaning moving things, rotating things, scaling things over time that you just can't do in Krita. So you have to sort of front load your animation work, thinking in terms of layers and pieces that you're going to then recomposite in Blender. So what I wanted to show here is, first of all, before I started, I did not have this window, which is a shading window. And so the first thing I'm going to show is, if you don't have a shading window in your Blender installation, then this is what you do. You just click this button here, and under General Workspaces, you would select shading. So where is that? Right here. Okay, and then that will create a new tab here for shading. And you're going to see in a minute why that's important. And then it used to be in Blender 2.79, you just hit Control U to save your startup file. In Blender 2.8, what you do is you go File, Defaults, Save Startup File. So what I suggest, since we have a Blender startup file that's really oriented towards the grease pencil, you can see right now if I just start drawing, I can just do my thing. So for the kind of thing we're going to be doing here, you definitely need this shading window, which I didn't really realize. I was looking for the parameters of, like, the idea here is that we're going to take components that were created in Krita and then map them to simple planes in Blender so that we can separate them out in 3D space. I figured the options would be over here, and discovered that it was rather clunky. There is a way, but it's so clunky that it's ridiculous, and you have to wind up resizing your windows and stuff to see what you're doing. So the best solution seemed to be to create a workspace completely dedicated to shading. Here's why. Okay, the first thing, and again, this is unique to our situation. If you're a normal Blender user, you probably are in object mode by default. Okay, we are not. We are in draw mode by default because we're oriented towards grease pencil drawing. So what you're going to want to do is hit Tab twice, which goes to edit mode and then to object mode. Okay, now that you're in object mode, you can begin to get to work. So what you're going to do is you're going to hit Shift A. And what you want to do is you want to, in the menu that pops up, you want to add an image, images as planes. So this is basically the simplest possible way to do this. Okay, in my case, let's say now I have to browse on my hard drives. Okay, that is under volumes. What Blender means by volumes is hard drives. Okay, so in my case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go L anime. I'm going to just browse, and I'm just looking for an image sequence. Okay, so here in this folder, obviously yours will differ from mine. You got this image sequence that was originally exported from somewhere. I don't even know if it was Krita. It doesn't matter for purposes of demonstration. Okay, so what you're doing is you're bringing an image into Blender that's mapped to a plane so that you can see it. So if we just selected this one, we would just get that one image. If you want the image sequence, you need to select the sequence with your rubber band. Okay, so now that would be the whole sequence. And there's a couple options that are kind of important related to mapping images to planes. Okay, one here, an important one, is animate image sequences. Okay, you want to click that if you're wanting to animate image sequences. Now, if you took separate layers from a Krita file that were exported separately, and by the way, let's stop for one moment and look at how that would be done. Okay, I happen to have a shot here that I'm working on in Krita. And basically it boils down to what you've got to do in Krita is kill the layers. If you so let's say you've got a multi-layer file here, which I do, and you want to get each separate layer out to be able to use it in Blender. So you're gonna deactivate any layers that you don't want, and then you're gonna make a choice. Your choice is gonna be either to just save this as a ping, so you could save as, in which case you choose ping, and that would allow you to just save that image. The ping format is important because if you save it as a JPEG, there will not be an alpha channel. In other words, you'll get no transparency in your image. It'll fill in a white background around your characters. We don't want that. We want to have the alpha channel. And so that's probably enough to show that. The only other consideration would be, in this case, this particular layer is animated. And so you don't want to do save as. What you want to do is render animation. And then in this case, the easiest way to bring it into Blender, especially if you want to have that alpha channel so that you can layer things and see things behind, in other words, if this character was painted and colored in, you would want this area here to all be transparent. Okay? And so when you render your animation, you would choose image sequence, and you would save it as a sequence of ping images. The base name is whatever you want to call your image, so I'll call this my image. Okay? Leave the default numbering starting at 0, that's fine. And Krita has wisely chosen to give us a total of 8 images. Okay, because we're doing image 0 through 8. And if I were to render that after choosing an image location, I would wind up having that image sequence ready and waiting for me to bring it into Blender, just the same way I'm doing here. Okay, there's one other consideration here in Blender that you want to think about. Excuse me, sorry about that. If you want to be able to light your scene after the fact, in other words, the stuff you're gonna bring into Blender is not inherently self-illuminated. Okay? If you wanted it to be self-illuminated, in other words, you basically want it to look exactly the way it looked in Krita, choose shadeless. And then Blender causes the resulting image sequence to be self-illuminated, and as I say, it looks exactly the way it would look in Krita. And frankly, if you were to add lights in your Blender scene, it would not do anything to this image sequence. If you want the image sequence to be, let's just say for simplicity, you want it to be black, but if you put some lights in the Blender scene, then it would illuminate your imagery, which could be useful for, say, color correction. Then you would choose Diffuse. Okay, Diffuse is not self-lit. Shadeless is self-lit. Emit is kind of a combination of the two, frankly. It's self-illuminating, but you can decide how strong the self-illumination is. Now, for simplicity, this time we're going to assume that you've got your color pretty much the way you want it out of Krita. You don't want to tweak the color. You just want it to look the way it looked in Krita. And at the end of the day, if there's any color correction to be done, that will be done later at the editing stage. Okay? So I'm going to choose shadeless. And those really are the two main settings you need to be aware of. You want to click Animate Image Sequences if it is in fact an image sequence. You want to choose shadeless if you want it to just be self-illuminated. Then you go over here and click Import Images as Planes, and you go, what's wrong? I can't see anything. Well, that's because of the current rendering mode in Blender. You've got wireframe. Let's see what this is called. This is called viewport shading. These two options, which are this would be, I'm not sure what they call it. They call it Look Dev. It used to be what was called Material Mode. And then this would be your fully rendered version. Normally you can get along fine with Look Dev. Okay? So now if in my case, the way my hotkeys in Blender are set up, which is the same as what I set up on Kyle's installation, is I hit Control Shift, middle mouse button, and I can rotate it, and you can kind of see what's going on in the 3D space. Okay, so now if I was going to be planning to do a camera move, you can see if I hit the 0 key that this is now lined up with the camera. It's the wrong size, so let's fix that right away. Okay, I'm going to hit S for scale and just size it up so it's the right size. Now again, Control Shift middle mouse button, you can see here if this did not have the background baked in, which obviously in this case it does, then you could hit G key to grab and move. Okay, GY moves on the y-axis. So if you were setting up a 3D camera move, it would be very normal to go GY, move this back a little bit, and then from the camera view you can see that it's now too small, so you would size it up again so that it looks right. Okay, and then as you could imagine, if this background again wasn't baked in, you'd probably have another single ping image back here that you would also size up even more because it's farther back in the y-axis. You would size that up so it also fills the camera view, and now if you were to move your camera this way in space, you would get that parallax effect that you always want when you're doing a camera move. Okay, now if we just hit the space bar and play this, as you can see, our image sequence plays back perfectly. Okay, so that's good. These are the basics. You're either bringing in a still image or you're bringing in a sequence. Okay, now we're going to find out why the shading view is kind of important. One thing we'll notice in this particular sequence is he starts moving on frame, looks like 30. Okay, so now there's really only two things I want to concern ourselves with now, because we're trying to keep this as simple as possible. Again, we're doing the least possible in order to just be able to do in Blender what we can't do in Krita. So we go to the shading window, and in the shading window what we see is this, which you will feel is a complete mess. Now the first thing I did was click here, because by default these were all selected, and if you try to move something they're all going to move together. So I hit the A key. Well, actually I could hit the A key twice, but what I did was I just clicked in the empty space. Now I can move these apart. The one that we're concerned about, and if we were to add other image sequences into the shot, we would see more of these, but this one right here is the one we're concerned about. Okay, so I'm going to zoom in on it, and you can see that this is telling us what our source is. In other words, we have a 3D plane, which is just a square, really. It's a very simple polygon. And this is what has been mapped or projected onto that polygon. Okay? We can see that Blender is smart enough to have discerned that there are 120 frames in the sequence based on what we selected when we loaded the image sequence. Okay, so here are the two things. Well, actually, there's really four things I want you to be aware of. Auto refresh, in almost all cases, you would want it to be clicked. What that means is when you hit the play button, as I'll do right now, the image sequence plays. If you turn auto refresh off, then you only will see whichever image happens to be the current one. So you almost always want that. But now the next couple options are important for this reason. In Krita, actually let's go back here. This is such a great example of what I'm talking about. In this shot, we have Akari being held by the bad guy. Okay, and we'll make that fully we'll turn the opacity back up so we can see what we're supposed to see. Now I have the Krita scene set to only be a very few frames. Therefore it loops. Loop, 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 loop. Okay, Akari is being animated on threes, as you can see here, every third frame, and the bad guy is being animated on twos, and it gives a really cool effect that is appropriate to the scene I'm working on. Okay, so when we come back here, imagine that this scene that has this 3D camera move is much longer than 9 frames, 8 or 9 frames. Maybe it's 3 or 4 seconds long. Okay, if it's 2 seconds long at 24 frames a second, the whole scene is going to be 48 frames. Well, that's kind of important to stop and be aware of. That means over here, you really want to set this to 48 if you wanted to have a 2-second long scene. Okay, set it to 48 frames. Now it's going to play from frame 1 to frame 48. Okay? But we already determined that our bad guy starts moving at frame 30. And that's what I want to show next. Okay? So these two options are kind of important. You could change this one if you said, well, I brought in 120 frames, but I'm only going to be using 48 of them. So you could actually change this so that now Blender's only going to consider the first 48 frames. But the important thing that we're interested in here for the purpose of setting up our scene is let's just pretend what we really wanted was for this guy to start his move at frame 1. Well, we know that he started moving at frame 30, so if we put an offset of 30 frames, then what should happen is when we go back here, we'll see. Okay, hold on. Well, yeah, that did work. It worked because remember the. Let me change this to. Let's change it to 28. Okay, sorry, I keep flipping back to Krita. Okay. Okay, yes. Okay, so you can see what's going on here. So now because we switched it to 28, there's actually frame. It starts at frame 0, by the way. So it goes frame 1, frame 2. Okay, does this make sense? He starts his move on frame 30. We set the offset to 28. That means that when we start playback, there's actually going to be 2 frames that go by. 1, 2, and then he starts his move. So if we wanted it to start on frame 1, we'd set the offset to frame 29. And that's, you would think it'd be frame 28, but I'm sorry, you'd think it'd be 30, but that's because Blender starts playback at frame 0 by default. So it's thinking in terms of a scene that starts at frame 0. That's a little confusing because our actual start frame for the scene is set at 1, not 0. So if this was set to 0, now our playback range is actually synchronized to Blender's default, the way it internally thinks about the frames. And so now we have frame 1, he starts moving, which makes sense because our offset was 29. So if we wanted him to be in the first initial position that we wanted him to get to right at the start, we would set the offset to 30, and as you can see, he starts moving at 30. Why is this interesting? It's interesting because here we could have a scene that's 2 seconds long, but what if we wanted his animation to actually repeat over and over? Okay? Well, what we could do is we could set his frames to only be, let's say, 6. Okay? And I'm going to move this offset back a little bit. I think you can see what I'm doing here. So what that did was that created a situation where 4 frames should go by before he moves, and then there it is. But we only want him to actually loop 6 frames over and over and over again. So then what we would do is we've already set this to 6, but there's one thing we forgot, and that's this thing right here, which is cyclic or cyclic. I don't know how you want to say that. If it's cyclic, that means it's going to repeat as a 6-frame cycle over and over and over. And now we come back here, and what we should see is him doing that same move over and over. And look, indeed he does. So now I've only talked for 20 minutes almost. And I want to say, this again is the least you need to know. If you have all of the stuff I've shown here, you have everything you need to be able to bring in image sequences from Krita and bring them into Blender, layer them up. We're going to assume, for our purposes, that we don't want to do things like, let's say we want to, there could be a scenario where you'd have an image of a character's head and another separate image of their mouth, where the lip sync is actually on a separate image sequence. Yes, you can do that. But at this point, for simplicity, and so we don't go insane, our policy is things like that, we do that in Krita. We bake our lip sync into the shot, and then we if possible, we actually have the lip sync and the character all baked together in a single image sequence. That's what we bring into Blender. But indeed, you could separate them out onto separate planes, and at that point, you could actually you could loop the lip sync, so that if you have a character that's ranting and raving, maybe they would be going through the same cycle of lip sync over and over and over, just the way I showed here. You create a shorter loop, and of course, it probably goes without saying that you could bring the same image sequence in multiple times with different offsets and loop settings and all the rest in order to set up a more complex animated situation. We basically don't want to do that. Okay? So now, there's really only one more thing that we want to be aware of in order to be able to do either 3D camera moves or whatever else we might want to do in Blender. Okay? As I go into the 3D view, one thing you will notice is that we cannot see a camera. There's no camera here. Well, yes, there is. There's a camera here, but I have the camera in our default setup scene. We have the camera invisible. Okay? Just because for my purposes and my general workflow, I don't care to see the camera, because then when I switch to front view, for example, I can actually see the camera in the scene, which I really don't want. So I normally have it turned off, but in the outliner here, you can turn the camera back on. Okay, so now I'm going to show two things. And this is basically translation animation in Blender 101. It doesn't get any simpler than this. Okay. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set a key for my camera. And generally speaking, sometimes you want to rotate the camera, but frankly, usually you don't. Usually what you want to do is just deal with the camera's location. So when you set a keyframe, you can set keyframes for lots of stuff, but what you want is location. Boom. Now in our case, we're going to do a zoom in over 2 seconds, and so all we're going to do is grab the camera, G key, Y on the Y axis, move it closer, and then we're going to set another keyframe for location. Okay? Now we don't see the keys appear here, and you're going to go, why not? Why don't I see? Here's a key. Well, no, that's a grease pencil key. You can see that, again, by default, in our setup, we're set up for grease pencil animation. So if you want to see what's going on with the camera animation, you need to switch to dope sheet. Now, as you can see, there's two keys that are visible, and lo and behold, look at this. Okay, so we've got our looped animation here, we've got our camera move here, and if we switch by hitting the 0 key to the camera view, lo and behold, there's our camera move. Couldn't be simpler. Okay, now I'm not going to pull in another image on a plane like I did before. I'm actually going to do the simplest thing possible, which is I'm just going to add a mesh, and I'm going to add a monkey. So I'm adding a 3D element to our scene. As you can see, there it is. Okay. Now from the camera view, the only reason I put the monkey in there is because the monkey is in a very different position in the y-axis compared to this plane. And so that's going to illustrate for you what parallax looks like. Because the monkey is closer to the camera, look what happens. See how the parallax is occurring? It's a true 3D move. And that's it. That's it. Now we know how to take elements from Krita, map them to planes, put them in 3D space. If you want to get fancy and cycle or loop your animations, you can do that. And I guess there's only one more thing I'll reveal, which is back here, if you decided, look, I completely screwed up, this is not what I wanted to see. Actually, I don't need ping images with an alpha channel or anything. I just have an MPEG-4 movie that I want to bring in. Well, you can change your source right here. So here I can go click on this little file folder, and if I go into one of my other folders, such as my render folder where I have lots of MP4s, I can select one, and now lo and behold we have the same situation. It's going to play back the same way. It's going to loop. Well, actually, strike that. Okay, Blender appears here in Blender 2.8 to not really understand how long this clip is. So that's kind of an important thing to be aware of. If I had mapped this movie to the plane through the add the way I did it in the first place, by adding an image map to a plane. Would Blender have known how long the movie is? The fact is, I don't know. And frankly, right now, I don't care. But notice that when I loaded a different video onto the plane, Blender set everything back here to a default, and unfortunately it doesn't seem to know how long the movie is. So just to be safe, I'm going to crank this up to 48, and then let's go back here. Of course we could hit play here as well. As you can see, that's working, but same situation. Alright, so now you can make things more complicated for yourself, and again, this is actually truly the last thing I'm going to say. You notice when I animated the camera, I don't know if I mentioned this, but I hit the I key. That's how I set the keyframe. The I key is how you set keyframes in Blender. Alright? You could click this little button which does auto keying. The problem with that is it can get unwieldy quickly, because what happens is that means that anytime you move or rotate or scale something, it sets a key. But it tends to set keys for a lot of parameters that you didn't actually want to set keys for, so it just gets a little complicated. So my recommendation is, for the kind of work we're trying to do and the reason we're doing it, which is basically to expand the capabilities of Krita, really auto keying is probably something we don't need to do, but we could. We could click this little button, and then by clicking RY, I can rotate this here, and then I go RY again and rotate it again later, and as you can see, now we've introduced a rotation as well into the plane. Okay? And so there we get that. And I'm going to leave it at that. We could get into things like parenting, parenting one object to another for animation purposes, but honestly, for the reason we're doing this, it's overkill at this point. We'll address that when it comes up and actually becomes necessary for a real shot. But for now, that gives us, in just a half an hour, it gives us, the, as I said, the least we need to know, the very, very least, to be able to do what we need to do so that we can at least solve some of the problems that Krita is just not up to at this point in time. So that's it. As you guys know, there will be more later. Thanks for watching.